Today's gospel takes place on Tuesday of Holy Week. Jesus is in Jerusalem, and he is challenging the Jewish leaders and the temple. And we've seen this in the last day or two in the daily readings from Mark chapter 11. And so they say, by what authority are you doing these things? Now, what are these things that Jesus is doing that challenges them? Well, first of all, as we heard, Jesus cursed the fig tree because it was not producing fruit. And then a little while later, when they returned to the fig tree, it had withered. And that was symbolic of a judgment he was placing on the temple worship because it had lost its effectiveness. He then rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. And this recalls Solomon's procession into Jerusalem as king of Israel in the Old Testament. This is Jesus again, symbolizing authority as king, truly king. He then goes into the temple and he drives out the money changers and the animals because he says, this is a house of prayer, and you've made it into a den of thieves. So these are very challenging incidents. But they go back also to the beginning of Jesus' ministry in Galilee, up in the north. And we see this in Mark, first 3 chapters, where he exercises authority over Satan by exorcising demons. He forgives sins. He claims teaching authority, supremacy over the Torah, and authority over the Sabbath. So all of these are the things that now bring it all to a climax. And so the question, by what authority are you doing these things, is put to Jesus. Now, as a good rabbi, Jesus responds with a question. And it's a devastating question. Jesus says, I will ask you, answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Now, this is a devastating question because if, in fact, John's baptism was from heaven, then that speaks to Jesus' authority because John baptized Jesus. And when he did, as it's recorded in the Gospels, the Holy Spirit comes down upon Jesus. And the voice of the Father says, this is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. And so if, in fact, John comes from heaven, so does Jesus. Now, on the other hand, the leaders know if they say John was not from heaven, then they're going to fall out of favor to the crowd because the crowd knows that John is a prophet. So they're caught in a trap, and they answer, we do not know. Now here's the authority that they have come to: skepticism, unbelief. In fact, they're afraid of public opinion. They're afraid of the crowd. So their authority is really compromised here. And in fact, there's 2 types of authority. There's bureaucratic authority, authority of an office, derivative. That's what the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin really have. It's not intrinsic to them. It's simply by virtue of an office. And that office now has been corrupted. Whereas Jesus has charismatic authority, authority by his very nature, his essence, as Son of God. Now that brings us to our feast today. This is the optional memorial for St. Paul VI. And he was an important pope, as we know, in our lifetime. He was elected in 1963, elevated as pontiff. And his authority was both charismatic and bureaucratic. Bureaucratic because he came to the office of Peter, and that's an important authority. Jesus gave that authority to Peter. And you are rock, on this rock I will build my church. I give you the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. And that office now is taken by Paul VI. But it's also charismatic because it's the Holy Spirit that is really giving the authority. And this is through ordination, the priesthood, now as successor vicar of Christ. Now this is important for us because with that authority comes the church. And it's important because the teaching of the church is authoritative. And there's various degrees of authority. As we know, there's infallibility in certain aspects of teaching on faith and morals, where the Pope can teach from the chair definitively on those matters. And there's the ordinary universal authority of the bishops in union with the Church. This is important for us because we need stability in our lives. We need to know what's true, especially in areas of faith and morals. There's so much out there in the world that is really uncertain. But we know how to get to heaven because of the authority of the Church, which teaches what's true, and by her sacraments helps us to keep the commandments. Now, our saint today, Pope Paul VI, was elevated at a time when Vatican II was convened by his predecessor, Pope John XXIII, but John XXIII died in the midst of the council, and so Paul VI took over. He had to reconvene it because when a pope dies, the council is at an end. The new pope reconvened it and continued the reforms started by John XXIII. Reforms to the liturgy, issues like the vernacular language, ecumenism, the universal call to holiness. And then after the council, of course, Pope Paul VI issued his own documents, encyclicals, such as Humanae Vitae, which really was prophetic. When we read it today, we see just how authoritative he was, how a prophet really led by the Holy Spirit. He brought a message of human rights, human dignity, and human development into the world, but especially at that very moment of conception, the dignity of life. Now, in the first reading, we get a sense of how we participate in this authority, because we have our own authority, certainly in our baptism and the sacraments. But the first reading from Sirach emphasizes there's another aspect of this teaching and this authority which comes from wisdom. And the wisdom is the wisdom of God. So in the first reading, we have Sirach saying, I sought wisdom openly in my prayer. My heart delighted in her. My foot walked on the straight path. I inclined my ear a little, and I found much instruction. I made progress in her. I resolved to live according to wisdom, and I was zealous for the good. I spread out my hands to heaven. I directed my soul to her, and in purity found her. With wisdom, there comes authority. And that means as parents, teachers, and in our own holiness. And that's why it's so important for us to take the scriptures as interpreted by the Church and then allow that wisdom to form us and shape us, that we exercise that authority that comes from wisdom and holiness. So let us continue now to celebrate the fact that God has blessed us with saints, with the Church, with our particular saint today, Paul VI, and with our own blessings of the Holy Spirit, by which we have that authority, that wisdom that comes from God.